Okay, hello everyone. We are live here. We are doing our 9 principles of executive communication. Welcome everybody. It's really great to have you. We're just going to dive right in. We're going to respect your time and go as quickly as we can. Just to give you a little bit of context about who I am, my name is Sam Milinchik. I'm the rabbi of a synagogue here in London with about 850 members. Over my career, I've given more than 1,000 talks in America, in Europe, in the Middle East, and obviously the UK as well. Tens of thousands of people have been impacted. And so these are some of my tips, some of the principles that I have come up with over those talks that have really proven to be the most foundational principles out there for public speaking. And they apply no matter where you communicate, whether it's in writing, whether it's in front of a crowd, whether it's online like this, it really doesn't make a difference. These are sort of the principles that cut right away, right across through all human communication. So let's get started. The first thing we have to understand is that the principles break down into 3 pillars. Okay. We have to talk about content, we have to talk about confidence, and we have to talk about technique. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with this quote by Albert Einstein, where he says, if I had an hour to focus on a problem, I would spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about the solution. And so that's really what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be spending the bulk of our time not on technique, which is what most people associate with public speaking. We're not going to be talking about how you walk around the stage, how you wave your hands, what kind of energy you're giving off. All that's important, but it's about, in my experience, it's about 5%. Okay. You can get away with being a pretty boring person to listen to if what you're saying is compelling enough. And now, if you don't believe me, I challenge you after this live stream to go on YouTube and type in Sam Altman. Sam Altman ran a course at Stanford when he was still the president of Y Combinator. And there he introduced, it was all about how to build a startup. And if you watch Sam deliver that address, what you'll see is that he is boring. He is not looking at the camera. He's reading off of a paper. He's not engaging the crowd really in any way. But it's one of the most viewed courses from Stanford online of all time. And the reason is because what he has to say is important enough. So we're spending the lion's share of these pillars of our time today on content and confidence. And then the technique is about 5% of it. And so what you see is that there's really 3 pillars, right? As we said, content, confidence, and technique. And each of these break down into a further 3 principles, making for a total of 9. And we're going to just fly through these. This is a high-level introduction to this. Every single one of these 9 principles is going to be relevant for your presentation. It's going to be something which is going to make you a better public speaker. And so the first of these is framing. The second is structure. The third is presentation. We're going to go, like I said, we're going to go into these. Each one of these breaks down into a further 3 pillars, 9 principles. Confidence, you have mindset, authenticity, and then how do you manage the stress when you're on stage? And then the last is technique. That's going to be your voice, your body, and your breathing. So let's dive right in. The thing we have to understand first, though, is if we go back here, you'll see in the middle of this screen here, we have something called ethos, pathos, and logos. And now these are things that were identified by Aristotle already 2,000 years ago as being critical components of any persuasive human communication. And now I will say something, we'll dive into this a little bit more when we get into content, but every single time you open your mouth to communicate with somebody, there is a goal there. There is something that you're trying to persuade, to communicate, to give over. And ethos, pathos, and logos, these stand at the foundation of every single human communication. So let's dive into them and see what they're all about. Ethos. Ethos is really, if I was going to summarize it in one line, it's how do people perceive you? Okay. How do I come across to somebody? Do they trust me? Do they not trust me? Okay. And these are things that are going to be given off really from an almost unconscious perspective. Okay. So things like, how similar am I to the person that I'm talking to? Right. And it's not that you can't talk to somebody if you're not like them, but it's that if you're not like them, you're already surmounting a barrier when you speak to them. Reputation. What is your reputation in the eyes of these people? It doesn't make a difference what you think of yourself. It's what they think of you. And that ties in also with authority. Okay. So I'll give you an example of this. Let's say that you're a doctor in a surgery. Okay. It used to be that doctors would wear white lab coats to signal that they were doctors. And then immediately by putting on this white lab coat, you conferred to yourself a certain amount of authority because people trusted the lab coat. That's ethos. That's something where you're trying to communicate a signal of reputation, trust, authority, whatever it is, without actually turning around and saying, I'm a doctor, you need to trust me. Okay. And oftentimes, the more that somebody says, you need to trust me, the more that you're going to say, why do you need to tell me I need to trust you? I actually don't trust you because you told me that. So ethos is going to be largely determined well before you get on stage, well before you get in front of the person that you're talking to, well before you write your article. It's going to be comprised of what people have heard about you before, how confidently you speak about your topic, how widespread your ideas are. All of these things are going to be relevant to how people perceive you. And I will tell you one thing, trying to change in a conscious manner how people perceive you whilst you're speaking is incredibly hard and almost always fails. So a lot of times people will try to sound smarter than they are. They'll use big words. They will reference all of these highfalutin ideas. And what ultimately happens is that that's not authentic. People see through it right away. And then it makes you not only not gain their trust, but it makes you look more untrustworthy. So the thing to do always when you're trying to communicate trust, the easiest thing to do is actually be trustworthy, actually have that authority. That's ethos. Pathos, and this is super important, and it undercuts, again, all of human communication, is all about how people feel when they're speaking to you. And this is something you have to remember about human decision making in general, which is a topic for another LinkedIn Live. But that is that human decision making is all about emotion and very little about rationality. And so when you're speaking, you need to be aware of how are people feeling about what I say. And this is going to be relevant to the stories that you tell, to the language that you use, to the tone of voice that you use. Okay, I'll give you an example. If I want to tell a spooky story, what am I going to do? I'm going to talk quietly. I'm going to get real close. I'm going to look you in the eyes. So the way that I communicate with you about the subject matter that I'm talking about will affect how you feel about that subject matter. And how you feel about that subject matter is going to be super important to how resistant you are or how open you are to actually accepting that persuasion, that communication. And then logos is important, but it's also the easiest of these things to get right. And that is, does what you're saying make sense? Okay, you could be, have the voice and the tone and the ethos nailed, but if you get up there and start talking gibberish, then actually it's going to be pretty difficult to take you seriously. So what you're saying needs to make sense, but it's also the least important. So there are a lot of rhetoricians out there that you can study, and when you actually take their speech and you write it down and read the transcript, you'll see it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It doesn't actually seem like what they're saying is rooted in reality. But because of how they delivered it and because of how much authority they had coming in, nobody really looked too closely. So logos is important, but it shouldn't be necessarily the main focus of what it is that you're trying to communicate. Right. So if we hop into content, then there are three pillars. If we just go back and remind ourselves, we're in content, confidence, and technique. These are the three pillars of good communication, each one of them breaking down into a further three. So let's hop into content. And now content has three parts to it. There's the framing, there's the structure, and then there's the presentation of what it is that you're saying. So let's look at the framing first. Framing breaks down into three topics: goal, audience, and emotion. Okay, the first thing I need to understand, the first thing, and you can tell if there's a speaker who hasn't done this, you'll know what I'm talking about in a second. The first thing you have to do is understand why I'm talking. Why have I gotten up in front of this audience? What am I going to say? What's the purpose of my talk? What's the aim? Am I trying to persuade, inform, inspire? All three, none of those three. What is the goal of my communication, right? And so many times people will get up and they'll just talk and they don't seem to have any aim. They're just sort of trying to fill time. That's the worst kind of public speaking, because what it does is, if you think about, we have this finite resource available to us called time. this finite thing, which is always ticking down. And if you get up to talk to someone and you're not exceedingly clear on what it is you want to say, all that you're ultimately doing is wasting their time. And that's not good for them. And it's definitely not good for you either. So the first thing you have to do is figure out what is the goal of my talk. And, when you go through this more in depth, you also understand that part of this is also getting your talk down in one line. So if I had to summarize my talk in one line, what would the summary of that talk be? If somebody talked about what I had to say to somebody else 2 weeks later, how would they summarize it? What would the underlying one takeaway message be? That's all in goal. The next is audience. You have to know who your audience is. If you're talking to a group of millennials, right? People who are 20, 25, they have grown up with a certain set of ideas, of assumptions, of preconceived notions, okay? You can't get up there. Let's say you're talking to a group of millennials and you are a boomer, okay? And, I grew up sort of in between millennials and boomers. So I sort of understand how boomers communicate and millennials. And so if I was a boomer and I got up and made some sort of racist, sexist, anti-feminist joke, whatever it was, and I wasn't amongst people who wanted to hear that kind of thing, what I've immediately done is upset everyone because I know they don't want to hear that kind of stuff. So your audience is so crucial. You need to determine, it's crucial for understanding how to talk to them. It's crucial for understanding the set of analogies or metaphors that they have at their fingertips. So if I'm an American getting up in front of a British audience and I start talking about baseball, or I say, oh, we're 0 for 3, what in the world does 0 for 3 mean to an English person? So it's very important that you get your audience really dialed in so that you can talk to them in their language, okay? By the way, this has to do with another tangential rhetorical point that Aristotle brought up, and that is something called decorum. Decorum is all about, it's not, the decorum that we have today, which is behavior or, not being too loud or rambunctious. Decorum to Aristotle meant speaking in line with people's expectations, okay? Not violating people's expectations. Now, is that to say that you can't ever violate someone's expectations? Absolutely not. And in fact, the more work you do here in this audience section to understand who your audience is, what things they expect, the more productively you can then come along and violate those expectations. If it's with a hook, if it's with the material that you're talking about, if it's with certain body language or other emotional triggers that you're using, but you have to understand your audience intimately. The next is emotion. And again, we said people are emotion driven, not rationality driven. And so therefore what you need to do is always think about, what emotion am I going to invoke with my speech, with my writing? And the emotion you choose to invoke will determine everything downstream. It will determine the language that you use and the storytelling that you use and the pacing and the tone of voice and the lighting of the room, for example, right? I don't know how many of you remember Alone in the Dark on Nickelodeon, but they had this show where they would sit in, around a campfire with a flashlight, to shine the flashlight up, and it creates this shadow, very spooky sort of atmosphere. That's all about emotion. It's all about evoking a particular set of feelings to put you in a particular mood. So that's really very important. That's all framing. That's all, everything that you do, the better the work that you do in framing, the better the work you're going to do in structure, and the better the work you're going to do in presentation. So framing will allow you to understand very, very well what you want to say, who you want to say it to, and what emotion you want to invoke. Everything else is downstream from there. Then you move on to structure. Structure is material. It's setting that material up in a particular order. So that's the logos that we talked about. And then it's about editing that material. So for material, what you're going to want to do, and this is very important, whenever I'm coaching somebody about public speaking, I always say, when you're gathering your material, your funnel should be super wide at the top. So you're putting everything in to your material that you possibly could that's anywhere near related to the goal, audience, and emotion that you want to invoke. Now, that's the only filter we're putting out at this moment. Is this somehow related to the goal, audience, and emotion that I'm speaking to? If it is, put it in the funnel. If it's not, take it out of the funnel. That's it. Okay. Logos is then organizing the basic structure of what you want to say. You want to make a particular point. You need 3 supporting points to get to that particular point. That's the structure. Editing is super important though, because editing now comes at the end. I might have put in 20 stories, but I might only have 5 minutes to talk. So editing is the process where you take all the material in the structure and you then cut out ruthlessly every single thing which is not connected to the goal, audience, and emotion and doesn't tell whatever it is that you want to tell in the most succinct, clear, easy to understand way. So editing, if you're going to pick one side of the structure to really double down on, editing is going to be the one. Because if you edit well, you can tell your story with very little waste. The less waste you have, the more effective your talk is going to be. Framing, structure, and now we're at presentation. Presentation is super important because people think, oh, the material that I have, well, it'll speak for itself. It's really important. And to that, I would say, okay, what about calculus? Do you like calculus? Did you pay attention in calculus class? And if you didn't, why not? Don't you know calculus underpins everything that we do in the modern world? It's at the heart of all of our modern technology. What could be more important than calculus? And you'll say, yeah, but it wasn't interesting. It didn't take my fancy. Exactly the point. So presentation is about taking the framing that you've worked so hard on and the structure that you've now got in place and making it interesting. Presentation is marketing for your speech. If you don't do it, no matter how interesting it is, it will get lost because nobody will be able to access that information. This is the difference between, a really dense academic work and popular science. Why does the popular science genre exist? That people can go and read the papers. Well, because the papers need translation a lot of the times. They're these very technical, very highfalutin ideas, really in depth. People don't have access to them. So presentation is all about giving access to the ideas. To that end, you need 3 things. Number 1, you need a hook. People are going to decide within the first 10, 15, 20 seconds, depends on who you ask, depends on what the structure of your talk is, depends on what the medium is as well. 15, 20, 30 seconds maximum, whether or not they're going to listen to you. If you lose someone, it's exceedingly hard, bordering on impossible to bring them back. So you want to do your best to hook them in the beginning. Now, it doesn't mean that the hook needs to be something wild and crazy. It just needs to open a loop. Okay, the key to opening up a hook, to doing a hook well, is opening up a loop. And if you don't know what I mean by opening up a loop, hum half of the verse of Happy Birthday. Happy birthday to, and then you stop. Everybody instinctively wants to say you, and it, by not finishing it, what you do is you create a tension inside. And once you have that tension, the more you can work on holding them at that tension point, the more you'll hold their attention. So you want to make sure that you're opening up a hook, opening up a loop, and keeping them there. That's 1. 2 is language. Again, super, super important. You've done the work on audience. Now pick the language that will talk to them. If you're talking to an academic audience, so maybe you'll want to use terms that they expect. If you're talking to 5th graders about the solar system, maybe don't use jargon that astrophysicists use when they talk to one another. The language that you use is going to be very important, A, for communicating your expertise, B, for not alienating someone, and C, for showing that you know what you know. So, I'll give you an example. The second that if I started using a lot of jargon, you can go on Google and type in rhetorical devices and get a list of 40 Greek names that are completely incomprehensible and impossible to understand. Okay. And so if I got up here and started talking to you about rhetoric and I started using these Greek long names and I was like, oh yeah, you know about this and you know about that, and you know about the other thing, you would be completely lost and know what I'm talking about. But if I said to you, oh, well, it's this thing where you say something 3 times, or you repeat yourself at the end of every sentence, or whatever, then you would be much more able to understand what I'm saying. So language is super important. And then storytelling. Storytelling, everybody loves storytelling, everybody misunderstands it, but ultimately what storytelling is the way human beings communicate. Okay, has a beginning, a middle, and an end. There's a transformation from point A to point Z or Z, depending on where you're listening from. There's a transformation that takes place in the middle. Something happens to someone through the story. Okay, the more compelling your story is, the more you'll identify with the person at the beginning of their transformation, the more invested you'll be throughout the story, and the more compelling that transformation will be. This is not about storytelling. We can get into storytelling later, but storytelling is going to be the medium through which human beings communicate. So you want to make sure that you get your storytelling down well. That's as far as content goes: framing, structure, presentation. Next, moving on to confidence. Now, mindset is one of those buzzwords that people hear and they just turn off because it's not a tangible thing. It's not something that I can point to, that I can touch, that I can measure. But it's so important to how you approach the talk that you're going to give, to how you come across in the talk that you're going to give, to the energy that you bring to the talk that you're going to give. And if you have the wrong mindset, even if your material is absolutely brilliant, there are plenty of people who are incredibly smart, but will never talk in public. They will never think about that. There are people who will never share their ideas in public because not because their ideas aren't good, but because their mindset doesn't let them. They're afraid to get up in front of other people. They're afraid to mess up. They're afraid to make mistakes. And so they won't share of themselves. They won't bring whatever it is that they could be bringing into the world. They won't bring it into the world. So mindset actually determines your ability to talk in public, how you show up when you talk in public, and the confidence that you have giving over your presentation. And the way I like to think about this is in 3 ways. The first is being childlike. Now, I don't know how many of you have children, but let's say that you have a child. Maybe it's not your child, maybe it's a niece or a nephew, maybe it's just a child you see, around in your neighborhood. What you'll notice about very young children is that they don't behave like they should. They don't know that they're not allowed to be themselves. They don't know that they're not allowed to be happy when they're happy, or sad when they're sad, or dance around in public without their shirt on. They don't know any of that stuff. Children just are who they are without any of these preconceived notions that come from the public, our parents, our teachers, whoever it is. And so if you can try and recapture that childlike essence and say, you know what? I'm going to get up here and I'm going to share what I need to share. I'm going to put into the world what I need to put into the world. And I really don't care what other people say. Because ultimately, just like with children, do you ever notice some people hate children? They can't stand them. Well, you know what those people do? They make every effort not to hang out with kids. And some people love kids. And you know what they do is they make every effort to hang out with kids. And it should be exactly the same thing with you. Some people are going to love what I have to say. Some people are going to hate it. Some people are going to vibe with my energy. Some people aren't. There's nothing I can do about that. And so when I approach it with a childlike atmosphere of, I'm just going to do what I need to do because I need to do it. That's what my personality calls for. And people can fall in line or they can go away. Well, then fantastic. So that's the childlike sort of approach to anything in life, really, but certainly to public speaking. The next is visualization. Visualization is one of these tricks that every high performer that I know of uses, certainly athletes. And it's a way for us to get extra reps at whatever it is that we're doing. It's a way for us to set ourselves up for success. And I can just give you one example here. They did a study where they put somebody in an fMRI and had them play piano. And they saw where their brain lit up where they were playing the piano. And then they had that same person imagine themselves playing the piano and not actually move at all. And the exact same brain centers lit up. And what the scientists from that study understood was that imagining yourself doing the thing and doing the thing are indistinguishable to your brain. And what that means is, and this is useful, by the way, for practicing an instrument, it's useful for practicing a speech. You can have an extra go or extra goes in your mind without ever sitting down in front of a piano, without ever getting up onto a TED stage and talking in front of 100 people or 1,000 people or whatever it is. You can practice whatever it is you want to practice as if you're doing it by visualizing it. And the next, obviously, super important but very rare is positive self talk. And here, all I mean is encourage yourself. If you make a mistake, pick yourself back up. That's all right. We'll do better next time. Have positive self talk rather than negative self talk. And if I wanted to encapsulate this in a quote that I heard recently, the quote would be like this: You can't bully yourself into changing. You can only love yourself into evolution. And that really needs to be the way that you approach your own self talk. And of course, there are ways of changing all of these things and adapting them and improving them. That's why we coach around them. The next thing is authenticity. You need to be genuine. And what this means is that you can't be putting on a show. The amount of people that can act and you not know that they're acting is very small. And most of them you know from Hollywood. Okay. The amount of people that can get up and talk about something that they have no experience in, they don't care about, and have any sort of authenticity or energy or connection with their audience is a very small, vanishingly small. And so I wouldn't try to do this yourself. I wouldn't try to talk about something that you're not genuinely interested in and genuinely know about. The next thing is you have to be vulnerable. If you don't share about yourself, what you're actually doing is robbing the people that are listening to you from a connection. So ultimately, you have to remember that we're all humans. We're all made of the same stuff. We all have the same brains and basically the same psychology. And so when I share of myself in a talk, when I share of myself in an article, I'm putting a recognizable piece of my soul out into the world. That is picked up by people who see it and say, I feel that way too. That resonates with me. That resonance comes from being vulnerable. Without the vulnerability of the speaker or of the author, then the words are stale and they don't carry any weight and they don't resonate in anybody's soul. So if you want to move people, you have to give of yourself to the talk. And the last thing in authenticity is that whatever you're saying has to be congruent. And what I mean by congruent, it has to be congruent with your own values. It wouldn't make sense to talk about something you don't believe in. It wouldn't make sense if you supported a particular political candidate to try and get up and support the or talk in favor of the other political candidate. It wouldn't make sense if you were anti-foresting to get up and talk about why it's important to cut down the trees. Nobody would be convinced about that, and you wouldn't be able to give any power to your words. So when you're talking and you want to be impactful and influential with your speech, it needs to be congruent with your personality. And the next thing is super important in confidence is stress management. These are tips and tricks that you can learn, putting yourself into the right frame of mind. There's certain physiological tricks. Oftentimes when people get very nervous, their body is flooded with adrenaline. There are ways of dumping that adrenaline to make sure that your heartbeat comes back down. I'll give you one trick. You breathe in 4 seconds, hold your breath 4 seconds, and breathe out 4 seconds. Do that a few cycles of that. And what it does is that slow breathing, it makes your heart rate slow down. When your heart rate slows down, you begin to calm yourself down. So there's lots of preparation, lots of physiological things you can do to dump that adrenaline, grounding yourself on the floor, sitting up tall, opening up your chest cavity, all these things. Preparation strategies. Are you going to memorize your talk? Are you going to have it written down on cards? Are you going to have certain cues in the environment? So this is actually a really interesting one. You can, there are certain memory tricks that you can peg pieces of information to certain things in your environment. And then when you look at them, you'll remember them. And then the question is in the moment, what are you going to do if you mess up? What are you going to do if you stumble on your words? What are you going to do if you get distracted? What are the ways, the tips, the tricks, the hacks that you can do to cycle your brain back online and keep the flow of the talk going? One really cool one, by the way, two really cool ones. The first one is pausing. Right? People don't realize how powerful a pause is and how little the people in the audience notice the pause compared to you. So if I pause right now, so that was 3 second pause, okay? But it actually, to you, probably felt very quick. And so the idea being that you can pause, try and remind yourself of where you were, and then keep going. Another quick hack you can do is just repeat the last phrase you said. People will appreciate that because a lot of times people are half listening. So if you repeat yourself, they will they won't notice you've repeated yourself, but it gives you that sort of extra minute, 30 seconds to bring your brain back online or remind yourself of what your train of thought was. So that's in terms of confidence, right? Mindset, get your mindset right, be authentic, and manage your stress. And the last piece, the last pillar of this is technique. And this is again important, but 5%, right? 5%. If you get all the rest of the stuff right, you're confident about what you're saying, and what you're saying is compelling and interesting, then the way you talk about it in terms of your voice, body language, and breath is not going to be determinative of whether or not it's an influential talk or not. So let's dive in for a few minutes. The first thing is your voice. Your voice, if you talk to singers, they'll tell you that the voice is an instrument and it can be learnt and trained like any other instrument. And there are a few ways you can modulate your voice. The first is with articulation. And this is something that, I see a lot of people will fall into because they're not aware of themselves. But there are certain sounds that when you put them next to one another will be difficult for you to say. So I'll give you an example of one of these for me. When I'm talking in a fast sentence and I want to say practice exam, I have to be very conscious of how I say practice exam because the sounds practice and exam are very close in my throat, in the back of my throat, practice exam. And so it's difficult for me to get from the back with the k to the front with the s and to the back with the x and the x in the back. X, and it comes all the way through to the front, right? And so practice exam is difficult for me to say. And so I know that about myself. So everybody will have these things. And make sure that either you slow down imperceptibly when you say them or just don't say them. If you know that when you put an R and an S next to each other, or a T and A and an R, it doesn't, whatever the sounds are that are difficult for you to say, either avoid them or just slow down a little bit. And tone also is super important. So if I'm not varying the tone of my voice, and I could talk to you very angrily. I'm angry, and this is my angry tone. Or hey man, it's all cool, it's all good, fantastic. The same words can be spoken differently, and the tone of voice in which they're spoken will make all the difference, which is why, by the way, WhatsApp and email are very difficult to communicate over because you can't communicate tone of voice. So I got an email the other day from my son's school and it said, "Can you please explain why your son was absent today?" Now, I could have read it nicely. "Hey, do you mind explaining could you please explain why, your son wasn't in school today?" Or I could be like, "Can you please explain why your son wasn't in school today?" And you hear the difference in tone makes all the difference to the meaning. And that's a way of changing the meaning of words and conveying messages just through the tone of voice. The next is pauses. Pauses are very important to give the audience time to breathe, to give them time to think about your idea, to add weight to a statement. So if I want to open up a very dramatic story, I might do something like this. I might say, "My mother's had cancer 3 times." And I might just let that land in the room. Now, I only pause there for 3 seconds, but the pause stretches on forever. And it lands and it imbues the room around you with an atmosphere sometimes so thick you could cut it with a knife. And if you're talented at using tone of voice and pauses together, the sky's the limit for you, especially when you add in vocal variety, which is the third part of voice, which is sometimes I'm going to talk really powerfully and I'm going to talk really loudly, and sometimes I'm going to really talk slowly and quietly, I'm going to draw you in with my voice. And so the way that you vary your voice, use the pauses, and use your tone of voice and articulation can convey another level of meaning over and above whatever's in the words of your talk. The next is body language. Okay. If I get up onto a stage and I'm slouched and I'm, giving off this sort of like, tired energy, well, that's one set of signals that you're getting from my body, from the posture of my body, from the posture of my eyes, from the cast of my face. All of that gives the audience information. I'm tired. I'm whatever it is. And it gets in the way. It can get in the way of your message or it can enhance it. And then there's movement. If I'm sitting in my chair like this, and the whole time I'm going like this with my head, so I'm talking, but I'm just doing this for 40 minutes, back and forth, then you're going to be like, what in the world is with this guy? I can't pay attention. I can't pay attention to anything he's saying because he's just doing this the whole time. Or if I was blinking rapidly for 40 minutes in a row, you wouldn't be able to focus on what I was saying. So movement is important. It can add a bit of interest if you're very good about moving around the stage and engaging different parts of the audience and gesturing with your hands. But if you have like these weird visual tics in the field, then what you're doing is you're putting static into your message. So imagine that you were listening to the radio and there was all this in the background. The louder the static, the more difficult it is to hear the music or the radio show. And so the more movement you have that's not coordinated or subtle, the more static you're adding to your message. And gestures as well is included in that. And then there's breathing. Now, breathing is not something any of us think about until it gets in our way. And there are some people who do not know how to regulate their breathing, especially when they're nervous. They don't know how to breathe from their diaphragm. So that's the first thing, is diaphragmatic. What do I mean by that? There are breaths you can take that are very shallow. You can feel it. If you do it with me now, you can feel it in your chest where you're just breathing very high up here. And now try to breathe, but using the muscle that's underneath your rib cage, the diaphragm. Expand your whole stomach out when you take a breath. And now when you're talking, your voice comes, because ultimately, what is a voice? A voice is air passing over vibrating vocal cords. And so the more robust that air is, the deeper that it's coming from inside of your diaphragm, your chest, as opposed to coming from up here, where if you take very shallow breaths and your voice starts to get really high and you start to get really nervous and then you talk really fast and then again. So you want to have slow, deep, diaphragmatic breaths coming from really deep in your stomach, and that will give you a full lungs. You'll be able to talk. You won't run out of breath mid-sentence like a lot of people do. They're talking. They forget to take a breath, and all of a sudden they run out of breath, and then they just sort of peter out, and then you don't know what they're saying because they run out of breath. So you want to make sure that you're breathing whilst you're talking. Another element, by the way, of breathing whilst you're talking is the cadence. Because the more that you're able to breathe quietly and naturally and calmly, the slower you're going to talk, the more interesting the cadence of your speech is going to be. And also, you give yourself a little bit of time to think. Now, I've been talking now for 40 minutes. None of what I'm saying is scripted. I don't have any of this written out other than the words that are on the slide in front of you. And that's just for you to know what it is that I'm saying and see how it all fits together. And so when you breathe well, you give your brain the ability to think about, okay, what am I going to say next? If I was talking a mile a minute and I wasn't breathing and I didn't know what I was saying, then I would get really nervous and I would. So the cadence is useful for the audience and it's useful for the speaker as well. And the last thing is breath support. Okay. What are some things that I can do to re-engage my breathing? What are some cues that I can use to bring myself back online? All this is going to be very important in terms of how it is that we use our breath and reset throughout the talk that we're giving. Right. So that's pretty much the entire overview. Those are the 9 principles. And if we're going to go back and just check the very beginning, just so we can go back and get the overview now that we finished, we have the principles: content, confidence, and technique. Each of those pillars breaks down into 3 themselves, making for a total of 9. In content, you have framing, structure, presentation. In confidence, you have mindset, authenticity, in stress management. And in technique, you have voice, body, and breathing. Of course, all of this informed by my reputation, what signals I'm giving off, the emotions that I'm trying to evoke in my audience, and whether or not my talk makes any sense. I'm happy to take any questions right now if anybody wants to throw some questions down in the comments. Otherwise, see you later.